Robert Honey Fabian was born on January the 31st, 1901, to parents Andrew Pinwill Fabian and his wife Ada Eliza Fabian, formerly Taggart, in Lewisham, south east London. His childhood appeared typical for the era. After completing junior school, his parents enrolled him in Polytechnic at the age of 12, to train as an engineering draftsman, creating intricate drawings or plans for machinery and buildings, just like his father. He performed adequately and successfully completed his exams. However, his lack of passion was evident. While he managed to secure a respectable drawing job, the lifestyle of being confined to a stuffy office all day did not appeal to him at all. One day in 1921, Robert met Inspector Frederick Rolfe, a friend of his parents, who, in his words, was the biggest man he'd ever seen. Robert sat in his parents' home and chatted with the inspector. He had considered becoming a police officer, but his vision of being a detective, shared by many at the time, involved solving cases in a deerstalker hat while smoking a pipe. Rolfe talked enthusiastically about his experiences in the police force, and the more he spoke, the more Robert was convinced that this could be the right career path for him. With the help of Inspector Rolfe, Robert filed his application form and delivered it to the Lewisham police station. Shortly after, he received the relevant forms to fill in. He had to be aged between 20 and no older than 27, height at least 5'9", barefooted, be able to read and write as well as sight dictation, and no basic maths. After passing his medical examination, he was ordered to report for duty at 2 p.m. on May the 17th, 1921. The first 8 weeks were obviously training, foot drills, first aid, patrol duties, and plenty of advice. And so it began. Robert was assigned as a PC attached to the Vine Street police station, and as a new PC he walked the patch with an experienced officer who showed him the neighbourhoods, patrol boundaries, and all the usual places he'd probably need to know, such as hospitals. Something I chuckled about was the fact that a PC had a speed limit. An officer would walk a standard stride of 2.5 miles per hour. Any faster, he was onto something, or hurrying home. Robert Fabian diligently performed his patrol duties by walking his beat along the back streets of Mayfair. He remained vigilant, fully aware that anything could happen. This led to several early arrests. However, in 1922, he received a discreet directive to be on standby at the section house at 1 a.m, without disclosing this information to anyone. It turned out that his training as a draftsman would come in handy when a raid on a Soho nightclub meant his job was to draw up a detailed plan of the club. He was later assigned to Vice, where he spent numerous hours observing brothels, clients, and women. He developed a deep respect for the women, admiring their good-natured and honest qualities. Among these experiences, he encountered some colourful characters who remained fond memories for him. His early days as a PC were filled with memories of good times with fellow PCs and the section house they all shared at 42 Beak Street, Soho, and the struggles of living on the £3 earnings a week. In 1924, 2 years after enlisting, Fabian applied to join the CID. Soon after applying, he was working on the streets in plain clothes as a CID trainee, being assessed by the authorities for his suitability. Fabian quickly realised that in order to comprehend certain criminals, he needed to dig deeper into their sordid lives, territories, and hangouts. The underworld wasn't glamorous, it was harsh and diverse. He claimed that police work drained his energy, as the job often extended beyond the end of his shift. In his early days, he dedicated his days off to walking the streets, seeking to familiarise himself with the city's places and people. He realised that a good detective never stops learning. While he learned a great deal during his examinations, like the detection training at Hendon, he asserted that the most valuable lessons were gained through his daily work. It was also in 1924 Fabian met and married Winifred Letitia Stockwell. As a married man, Fabian showed respect for the patience his wife showed, as the detective she married was often away for long days and nights, sometimes not coming home for days, eventually coming home exhausted, weary, and not very good company. As he gained experience, the young detective's work during these years was marked by meticulous attention to detail, a deep understanding of criminal behaviour, and an innovative approach to solving crimes, which often involved the use of cutting-edge forensic techniques of the time. Robert Fabian's career and exploits became the stuff of legend within the annals of British policing. His career spanned several decades, during which he became one of the most celebrated detectives in the history of the Metropolitan Police. One of Fabian's first cases as a young 25-year-old assigned to Vice was the case he called Mad Emile and Charles the Acrobat. During the early months of 1926, London's vice scene was predominantly controlled by various European criminal factions. The challenge for the Vice Squad was that many of the seasoned officers were too recognisable to infiltrate these gangs effectively. However, Fabian's relatively young appearance and smaller stature, especially when compared to his fellow detectives, rendered him an ideal candidate for undercover work. Consequently, he was assigned the task of discreetly circulating among the notorious clubs and gathering spots of Soho's most unsavoury characters. On one particularly foreboding night, as a group of Frenchmen quietly enjoyed their drinks in a well-known Frith Street hideout, the atmosphere abruptly shifted. Mad Emile, a notorious French gang leader, made a dramatic entrance, flanked by his entourage. The room instantly became tense and silent, signalling the gravity of his presence. After a while, they left the establishment, leaving behind an uneasy calm. April the 5th marked a significant turning point for Fabian. It was Easter, and he was the detective on call. The night had begun uneventfully, as he was engrossed in his studies for an upcoming exam. The sudden ring of the telephone shattered the silence. Upon answering, he was met with urgent news of a shooting murder on Soho's Frith Street. Without hesitation, Fabian responded to what would become his inaugural murder investigation. Upon arriving at the club on Frith Street, he realised it was one that was well known as a notorious haunt for French gangsters. He made his way through the crowd and down the stairs that led into the club. His first sight was that of chaos, the room wrecked with chairs and drinks thrown around here and there. Slouched in a corner lay a man, unresponsive, with a bullet wound in his stomach. Fabian ordered the constable to make sure nobody left, called the police photographer and fingerprint department, and of course the divisional detective inspector. With a stern tone to his voice, he returned to the customers and demanded to know what had happened and who had committed the crime. They conversed in French, unaware that Fabian had picked up enough French during his numerous visits to similar bars to not only understand them, but also reply in French. When pushed by Fabian, they learned the man was Monsieur Balada, who was visiting from Paris. Another man, who they claimed they had never seen before, was playing billiards. Balada began teasing him. Before they knew it, the stranger pulled out a gun and shot Balada. Before escaping, he was allegedly hit over the head. A frustrated Fabian needed the dead man's first name, but the group was not forthcoming. Fabian observed the unfriendly atmosphere in the room. Looking around, he sensed a person who appeared to be a little bit uneasy. he discreetly approached the individual and inquired about who they'd seen. After glancing around to ensure he wasn't seen as a snitch, the man quietly revealed the name Charles Ballader, an acrobat. A shocked Fabian knew that Charles the acrobat was a known gang leader. He continued to push. Who did this? Who killed Ballader? Emile, he shakily said. Mad Emile Berthier. The divisional superintendent and the divisional inspector made their entrance. Fabian gave them all the details he had collected, informing them that the perpetrator had escaped. His superiors questioned Fabian as to what he had done about arresting Mad Emile. Fabian stuttered his response that he hadn't actually started that process yet. They were disappointed that he hadn't sent out men to check hospitals, doctors, chemists and rail stations. Had he dispatched photos and information from police records? No, he hadn't, he responded, feeling more and more deflated. You'll need to wake up if you want to be in the CID, the superintendent barked. At that moment, Fabian remembered he was a member of a strong team of men and not Sherlock Holmes. The superintendent then turned to the gathering of officers and sent out his orders, with Fabian being the last to receive his. He was sent to St George's Hospital, Victoria Station and Westminster Hospital. He had no joy at the hospitals, nobody admitted with head injuries, so he headed to Victoria Station. Still nothing. The inquiry office hadn't seen anyone with a foreign accent or with a head injury. He walked up and down the station talking to staff. In the washroom he asked the attendant, who exclaimed, "Why, yes, I saw such a person. He asked me when the next train to New Haven was due, as if I'd know that." Fabian went straight to Colvine Street Station, where he spoke to Sergeant Squire, who told him he'd give the information to the special branch regarding New Haven. He then added he'd let Fabian's wife know he'd be late, which eased his mind, as she was expecting their first child. Fabian grabbed some sandwiches and made his way back to the crime scene, where the superintendent jokingly chastised him for taking so long to return. He was detailed to stay with Detective Tommy Symes, and the two of them stood guard over the cold, dead body. Hours passed and Fabian thought about his expectant wife. When he suggested to Tom that he should maybe call to find out what's going on, Tom advised him that that wouldn't be a good idea. Another lesson learned not to whine when put on a case. The coroner turned up at 9 a.m. the next day and the body was removed. Fabian, desperate to get home, was told, "Nope, you've got paperwork to do before anything else." Back at Vine Street, the superintendent growled at Fabian, "You've got a lot to learn, lad," before patting him on his shoulder and congratulating him on catching his first murderer. Because of his investigation, the special branch had caught Emile Berthier at New Haven. Fabian called his wife with the news that he'd caught his first murderer, to which she replied, "That's great. Now come home and tell your son." Fabian would go on to participate in many other cases, such as the demob suit. After returning home from his shift, a tired Constable Arthur Collins had just got ready for bed when he heard a sound. After looking out of the window, he realised a window of a warehouse had been broken. He quickly dressed and took off towards the warehouse. His worried wife looked out to see her husband being brutally beaten by 5 men. As she rushed to the door, she heard a faint sound of a police whistle. The small woman, dressed only in her nightgown, tried to pull the man who was beating at her husband away. She grabbed his jacket and pulled. It ripped, and she was sent flying back, followed by a fist hitting her hard in the face. The screaming woman sent the men running. Warwick Police Station was just 200 yards down the street. Officers heard the screams and shouts. They ran to try and catch the fleeing criminals, but they were too late. While Constable Collins lay in a hospital bed, clinging on to life, detectives spoke with a shaken Mrs. Collins, who still had the ripped piece of jacket in her hand. This piece of cloth was shown to various tailors and outfitters who didn't recognise the material. For 9 days they searched for the perpetrators, thoroughly looking in empty properties, dustbins, hedgerows, any place they thought someone might have disposed of a jacket. On the 10th day they asked for the help of a Scotland Yard officer. Fabian was given the job, along with his assistant, the shrewd, tough detective sergeant, Arthur Vesey. The first job was to check on the material Mrs. Collins had managed to grab. It was the lapel torn from the buttonhole up. After an examination, he ordered it to be photographed. The photo was distributed to every major newspaper. Afterwards, Fabian approached the editor of the local newspaper and had a copy of the photo pinned to the office wall. He and Vesey sat at a nearby table, watching as people came in to view the exhibit. Cars with loudspeakers drove around the town, encouraging everyone to go and see the jacket piece. Many people came, and there were similar remarks of people having recognised seeing something like this. The reason for this would become apparent. With each piece of information given, the officers were sent out to investigate. Then a young man approached Vesey and told him with great certainty that the cloth was part of a demob suit. This wasn't the news they'd hoped for. There were millions of demob suits that were handed out in the summer of 1946 to soldiers, airmen and many others. A little disgruntled, Fabian and Vesey took the material to a branch of the Ministry of Supplies that was based in Birmingham. It was discovered that that particular pattern was made by Fox Brothers in Somerset. 2 Somerset detectives went the very next day and discovered that this particular patterned material was contracted for the Royal Ordnance Depot, mostly in Birmingham, but some was sent to Fraser Ross in Glasgow. After checking the 2 depots in Birmingham, they discovered that both depots hadn't started to use that material yet. This gave Fabian and Vesey a boost and they set off for Glasgow. At Fraser Ross, the material was identified and the tailor who made the suit gave a description of the man who had bought it. He remembered him as he was a burly man and none of the demob suits fitted him, so he had to have one specially made. A bonus, they had an address to where the suit had to be sent. After travelling back to Birmingham, they knocked on the door and a large Irishman answered. He stood tall with his fists clenched when Fabian asked about the demob suit. His first response was that he'd sold it. This would change when asked about an address for the purchaser. He then replied he didn't sell it. He now remembers he had burnt it on the kitchen fire because it didn't fit him. Fabian looked him in the eyes and responded that he knew first-hand that a Scottish craftsman had made the suit to the exact measurements he had been given by himself. The tall man paled when he was told they were also going to see if Mrs. Collins recognised him. Constable Collins eventually recovered, and the man was sentenced to 4 years penal servitude at Northampton Assizes. The rest of the gang were also caught and were given assorted sentences. Robert Augustus Delaney was a pioneering British cat burglar, known as the first of his kind. He utilised a length of black silk rope and a long, slender tool to unlatch windows. Adorned in formal evening attire, he would scale affluent residences using the rope and access windows with the tool. On his first conviction in 1924, he received 3 years penal servitude at the Old Bailey. On his release, This daring, well-educated and quick-witted young man had made the decision that for the rest of his life he would continue to use his athletic, well-built body to flit across the roofs of London's elite and leave his fate in the hands of God. By the time he died in Parkhurst Prison in 1948, he had spent 20 years in various jails. In his brief intervals of freedom, his immaculate pointed Louis Vuitton shoes had scarcely time to become worn down at the heels. After Delaney's first theft, it was reported to Vine Street when Fabian was still a young trainee. The victims of his first crimes were questioned, but nothing was learnt about who would have committed the crime. One after another the thief hit affluent homes, stealing jewellery. Fabian and his pal Tommy Symes were not on the case, but it intrigued them so much knowing that the guy, whoever he was, had got away with 5 break-ins, stealing jewellery worth up to £30,000. Unbeknownst to each other, both Tommy and Fabian had been keeping a close eye on what was going on. When they discovered what each was doing, they decided that 2 heads were better than 1 and compared notes. They realised they had the same idea. They had drawn up a map of the areas that had been hit. They came to the conclusion that a certain area could possibly be the next hit, and on that night, after they learnt they wouldn't be needed for the rest of the night, they smiled at each other, and both Symes and Fabian decided to take some fresh air via Green Park. The area they thought the burglar was possibly going to be that night. Nothing happened. They were left chilled to the bone and went home to thaw out. The next night was pretty similar. Tommy discreetly waiting near the bandstand at Green Park, while Fabian waited in a garden concealing himself in the darkness. As the lights in their neighbourhood went out, a dark figure made his way nimbly over some garden rails and vanished from sight. The 2 detectives watched as the figure flitted from balcony to balcony. Tommy turned to Fabian and gasped, "Did you see that? How the hell did he get up there, like a blooming cat?" Fabian shrugged. "Look," he said, "you go and give the alarm inside, and I'll wait here for him." Tommy raised the alarm and Fabian watched as the lights suddenly lit up the building. He heard the shouts and the struggle to open the door. Fabian then watched as he ran after the cat-like figure, balancing and jumping with ease over the balconies. He jumped and disappeared into the night. They spent hours hunting the area for any clue, but couldn't find one. The inspector wasn't happy. Growling at the 2 young detectives, "Well, you could have told the rest of us what you were up to," he scathed. "So we could maybe have had more officers there." Looking at Fabian, he roared, "You say you saw him, and yet you have no description, only that he moved like a cat. He wasn't wearing fur by any chance, was he?" Feeling well and truly told, Fabian and Tommy went the next day to look over the scene again. This time they discovered some oddly shaped shoe prints that were wedged and pointed at the toe. These, they believed, must have been specially made shoes. So, armed with a photo of the prints, they scoured the shops where craftsmen made shoes. They finally came across the one shop that had made the shoes that were especially asked for by a gentleman, Mr. R. Radd, who had paid 5 guineas. The address that had been given turned out to be false, but Fabian decided to inspect the area and frequent some of the clubs. While going in full evening dress into a club, he was passed by a man whose shoes didn't make a sound. Fabian thought that odd, and the man noticed. With that, he jumped into a cab. Fabian quickly jumped into another cab behind and said that line that we all know and love, "Follow that cab." They followed as far as he could up a side street near Half Moon Street. The man got out and entered number 43. Back at New Scotland Yard, Fabian searched records. There was nothing about the man or the address. They tailed the man for 2 days. The man entered Hatton Gardens and met another man. They both went by cab to another house at Southgate, where they entered together, but only the pointy shoe man left. In a van, and yes, even back then they had an undercover van, a Morse code signal came through, letting them know that the man who had remained inside the house had admitted to paying another man £800 for stolen jewellery. They had him now. They went straight round to number 43 and searched a shocked Mr. Delaney's room. With a smile on his face, Mr. Delaney jokingly inquired, "I suppose it's too much to hope that you gentlemen are burglars?" As the detectives searched and discovered the 800 hidden under his mattress and the stolen jewellery hidden in a dressing table. Please forgive me if I pronounce any of these names wrong. The murder of Alec de Antiquis of Tottenham Court Road in 1947 was, for Fabian, one of the more intriguing and tragic cases of post-war London. Alec de Antiquis, a 31-year-old father of 6, was fatally attacked on the bustling streets of the West End of London on the afternoon of April 29th, 1947. That fateful afternoon, de Antiquis, a well-regarded figure in his community and the owner of a prosperous little motorcycle repair shop in South London and a one-time corporal instructor in the Home Guard, was reportedly heading home. 3 masked men had raided a shop. The shop's manager, Alfred Ernest Stock, was beaten about the head with a revolver, and the 3 robbers ran into the street after firing the shot. Alec de Antiquis tried to stop the 3 robbers fleeing from Jay's the Jewellers at 73 to 75 Charlotte Street, London, W1, by driving his motorcycle into their path. In the attempt, he was shot in the head and left mortally wounded on the pavement. The robbers managed to escape into the bustling traffic. On that exact date, Fabian had been put in charge of number 1 district of the Metropolitan Force, the entire West End of London, when Chief Superintendent Tom Barrett went on holiday. Shortly before lunch, Fabian received a call from Chief Inspector Higgins. He was informed about the situation, and a young man who had tried to stop the fleeing individuals was in the hospital and not expected to survive. Fabian gave Higgins instructions to get the photographer and the fingerprint people, Superintendent Sherrill or Sid Birch. Also the divisional surgeon. He suggested to see if the forensic people could help. When Fabian arrived at the scene, he discovered exactly what had happened. 3 young masked men with loaded guns had rushed into Jay's just after lunch, one of them jumping the counter. The 60-year-old director of the firm, Alfred Stock, heaved the big safe door shut, but the gunman chucked a pistol at his head and, leaping upon him, hammered him with the steel barrel of the gun until he fell bleeding to the floor. The gunman demanded the safe keys from the 70-year-old manager, Bertram Thomas Keats, who threw a heavy wooden stool. A gun boomed and its bullet thudded into the shop wall. More assistants appeared. The gunmen fled outside where their car waited. But a lorry blocked the way, so they abandoned the car, ran down Charlotte Street, eyes wild above their scarf masks. Guns clutched in white-knuckled fists. People on the pavement scattered. Then a motorcyclist drove around from behind the lorry and with quick decision, seeing the running gunman, switched off his engine and skidded the heavy bike into their path. They shot him through the skull. He fell, the motorbike toppling across his limp body. The gunman ran on into the busy traffic of Tottenham Court Road. Mr. Alec D'Antiquis, father of 6 children, was left dying in the gutter. Fabian spoke with Antiquis as he was gently placed into the ambulance. He told Fabian, "I'm all right. Stop them. I did my best." Fabian had heard his last words. There was plenty of evidence to work from. They had the bullets from the shot and from the poor man's wound, the gun that had been dropped at the scene, the stolen abandoned car, and 27 witnesses. Unfortunately, Fabian was informed by Fred Sherrill they couldn't find any fingerprints on the car or from the workshop that would have helped in their investigation. Inspector Higgins gathered all the witness statements, but he wasn't hopeful, as they all seemed to differ in some way. Fabian hoped for better news from the forensic lab going over the car, but after a full and thorough inspection, nothing was found. Fabian called in all the witnesses to go through the criminal's photographic books to see if they could recognise any of the culprits, and the next day Sir Bernard Spilsbury was called in to do the post-mortem, and firearms expert Robert Churchill examined the bullet and determined it had been fired from a .320 calibre centre fire revolver. After 3 days without sleep, a ray of hope walked into Tottenham Court Road Police Station. Mr. Albert Victor Grubb, a taxi driver, gave the police some interesting information about 2 young men wearing handkerchiefs over their faces, running into a building on Tottenham Court Road just after the incident. Fabian listened as Mr. Grubb gave him the address he had seen the men run into. Brook House, 191 Tottenham Court Road. At dawn the next day they waited outside in a squad car when Leonard Joel, the porter, turned up to sweep outside. They approached him and asked him if anyone had visited the building that he didn't know. He thought for a moment and showed them a key he had found outside, claiming it didn't belong to anyone inside the building as he had asked around. Fabian sent his men to check the key in the lock of the abandoned car. It fitted. When the Brook House office boy, Brian Cox, arrived that morning, he was asked by the police who he'd seen entering the building. He managed to tell them that just after 3 p.m, 2 young men had rushed past him, and he noted that one of the men, a tall man, was wearing a raincoat. Then after a few minutes he saw them looking through windows. When they noticed they'd been seen, the tall man no longer had on a raincoat and asked if a Mr. Williams was in. Cox told them he'd never heard of that name in the building. Hearing this, the police searched the building, and eventually in an empty room they discovered a bundle of clothing, the coat, scarves and the knotted face masks. The makers' labels were removed, but luckily the inner lining, torn away, gave way to a hidden stock ticket of a firm of branch makers based in Leeds. After an inquiry, Fabian was informed that the only information they could give was that the raincoats were delivered to 3 shops in London. Fabian hoped for good news from the Hendon lab, but unfortunately they also couldn't find anything on the hats or scarves. The shop managers for the first 2 shops gave all the information they could on the coats that came from Leeds. After the retailers provided the police with the 2 names and addresses of the coat purchasers, they contacted them to request that they bring the coats directly to the police station, which they promptly did.
On visiting the third shop, manager Arthur Amos was happy to give them the address of the purchaser in Bermondsey. Fabian called at the house. A woman answered and acknowledged that the coat belonged to her husband, but he had it stolen from a pub about a week before, she claimed nervously. Outside, a plainclothes police officer waited in the dark, and when he saw the woman come out, he followed her to another house. Now this house was the home of a family called Jenkins. Fabian knew that the oldest son was in prison for manslaughter during a smash and grab on a jeweller's in London. Interestingly, the other son had just been released from Borstal. When Fabian returned to the station, he learned that a young boy had been mudlarking at the side of the Thames in Wapping and had come across a gun. After an extensive examination by gun expert Mr. Churchill, it was identified as the gun that had been used to shoot Mr. Antiquus. The husband of the woman in Bermondsey was brought in by the police, who had been waiting for him to return. He looked over the coat and admitted it was his, but he'd left it at a cinema. When Fabian asked him which of the two was telling the truth, as his wife had claimed he had lost it at a pub, he eventually gave in and told him she had lent it to her brother, Harry Jenkins. Harry, at 23, was not afraid of the police. By the age of 20, he had been convicted twice for assaulting a policeman, breaking the jaw of one PC. He was a leader of the young men in the neighbourhood and had earned the moniker the King of Borstal. When Fabian and his men called at Jenkins' home, the young man smiled, looked at the coat and said it looked familiar, but would say no more. Jenkins was taken in for more questioning, while Fabian and his officers looked for his close friends who hung around with him.
Christopher Geraghty and Peter Robb. A lineup was arranged and the 27 witnesses watched as the line of similar men were paraded in front of them. It was a long few days and Fabian was tired and irritated. Unfortunately, not one witness picked Jenkins out of the lineup, and Jenkins smiled his cocky smile as he passed by Fabian. Unfortunately, they had to let all three men go, and off they went, closely followed by a detective. A few days later, Jenkins and his sister were called into the police station again to discuss what had happened to the raincoat. A cocky Jenkins sat smoking and looking at his sister and said, "Let's tell him what happened to the raincoat." He went on to claim he had lent the coat to a friend, Bill Walsh, who he had met while in Southend, who was there to see a girl who worked as a waitress. They now had another name and went straight to Southend, where they spoke with the local officer. The officer looked through his notebook and did indeed have some information for the detectives. He had noted that there were two men acting suspiciously on April the 25th at 9:40 p.m. Their names were Christopher James Geraghty and Michael Gillam. It was also noted that a loaded revolver was found in some bushes on April the 26th. They searched around Southend for a while before going to see the girl. They spoke with her parents, who told them they had indeed seen Bill Walsh on the 25th, and he was there with Jenkins. According to the father, Bill Walsh had suddenly disappeared. Fabian and his colleagues deduced that the two men, Jenkins and Walsh, must have done a job together, and Walsh took off with the loot, leaving Jenkins wanting revenge. The police searched all the properties Walsh was associated with and found some stolen watches from a robbery that had been carried out a few days before the murder. A full-scale bulletin was issued for Walsh. It didn't take long and 37-year-old Walsh was caught in Plumstead. When he was informed that he could be held for one of two reasons, robbery or murder, the cocky, confident man looked shaken and spent some time pacing the room before sitting down and giving the information that he had spoken with Harry Jenkins, Geraghty and someone else who had decided against doing the job. He admitted to doing a recon of the premises, but that was all he did. He went on to tell of the robbery at gunpoint in Queensway with Jenkins and Geraghty and someone he knew as Joe. It was just after that they all went to Southend, and Walsh admitted to running off with the £5,000 worth of jewellery. Joe was eventually identified as Michael Joseph Gillam. Walsh and Gillam went to court for the Queensway robbery and were sentenced to 5 years each. Back at Wapping, another boy found another gun in the mud of the Thames. This gun was identified as a weapon used inside the shop, not the one used to kill Antiquus. They now had both the guns and arrests were being made. Geraghty was taken in and gave up Rolt. He and Jenkins were firm friends, and it became obvious to Fabian he wasn't about to give them his name, but continued to give information without uttering Jenkins' name. He told the whole story of how they stole the guns from a gunsmith shop, to Rolt doing a recon on the jewellers' shops. He and Jenkins, or should I say he who shall not be named, stole the car. Rolt was arrested in the early hours when he was only 17 years old, then Jenkins. All three were indicted for murder. All three were found guilty, but Rolt, being too young for the death penalty, was sentenced to 5 years, and Jenkins and Geraghty were sentenced to hang at Pentonville Prison on September the 19th. This next case is one of my favourite cases, and one that is very known. The cold case of Charles Walton, the Meon Hill mystery. As I've already made a complete video of this case, I'm only going to skim over it from the aspect of Fabian's thoughts and conclusions. On Valentine's Day 1945, Fabian returned home late to see a note on the table asking him to call the CID commander, as Warwickshire Chief Constable had requested the help of Scotland Yard. After setting his alarm for 5 a.m, he called the night duty inspector to check that the murder bags they kept were ready with working torches. These bags were equipped with all they needed, from gloves, torches, handcuffs. Fabian also kept some other objects in his, such as a screwdriver, nails, hammer and ink. Fabian and his assistants arrived in Lower Quinton early and were met by the incredible and elusive Inspector Spooner from Warwickshire Police. I say elusive as I've been trying to find out more about him and the cases he'd worked on for some time, but it's been difficult. Anyway, Fabian and Albert Webb met with Spooner on that cold, dark, damp morning, while the small village of Lower Quinton began to wake up to a day that would be far from usual. On the field hedgerow lay the body of an elderly man. His name was Charles Walton. His injuries were horrendous. A sickle blade of a trouncing hook had ripped open his throat, his face frozen with fear, and a pitchfork deliberately pinned through his body into the ground. His young niece had been the one to find the body. Fabian's first thought was of a motive. Robbery? Revenge? A row? Webb interjected a possible maniac. Spooner, as we know, had his own thoughts on the matter and showed the group of detectives a book telling them they should maybe look at it. It was by J. Harvey Bloom, called Folklore, Old Customs and Superstitions in Shakespeareland, and was written in 1929. In it claimed that in 1875 a young man killed an old woman named Anne Turner with a hay fork because he believed she had bewitched him. Spooner then showed him another book where it told of a man named John Haywood who stabbed to death an old woman with a hay fork, exclaiming he would kill all 16 women who were witches in Long Compton. It was apparently an Anglo-Saxon mode of killing, using spikes to kill those they suspected of witchcraft.
The two Scotland Yard men were sceptical, but Spooner smiled, knowing they'd find out for themselves once they started to question the villagers. The investigation was very thorough, using many modern, for the time, techniques. An HQ was set up with a suspect wall and map. The wall was covered in all the photos they had from the scene of the crime. Detective Sergeant David Saunders, a fluent speaker of different languages, tackled the prisoners of war from the camp that was close by, and Fabian and Webb dealt with questioning the 493 village residents, including those that had visited the village around that time. The residents were not forthcoming. The only suspect they came across, according to Fabian, was an Italian prisoner of war, but he turned out to have been poaching near the area. Although Fabian didn't really believe in all the supernatural stuff, he was taken aback by the strong belief the locals had. Fabian remembered that he had witnessed a black dog descending a hill. When he inquired if it belonged to a boy nearby, the boy appeared frightened. Spooner then shared a local legend about a man encountering a black dog that transformed into a headless woman that rushed past him. The next day, the man's sister passed away. Fabian stared at Spooner and asked, "Who was this man?" "A man called Charles Walton," replied Spooner. The next few days some odd incidents happened. A dog was run over, a heifer died in a ditch. Fabian noted that when he and Webb tried to talk with the locals, the doors were shut in their faces and the locals had closed ranks, telling them nothing. They did as much investigating as they could on this case, but in the end this case got the better of Fabian and Webb. Although Fabian had an idea who was possibly responsible, the case was unsolved and Fabian returned to London. The case is still open to this day. One of the many, many cases Fabian worked on is the Rotham Hill murder. A story set in the early days of post-war Britain. The victim, Dagmar Peters, had a Polish name, but preferred to go by Peters. And to be honest, I couldn't pronounce her Polish last name if I tried, so I opted to use the name she used in the UK. She had set out early that morning from her home, which was a wooden hut in Kingsdown in rural Kent. She was in her late 40s and unmarried. For 25 years she had worked as a telephonist for the GPO, but after the London house where she had been lodging was bombed in 1941, she suffered a nervous breakdown. She took early retirement and moved to the country. Her 10-foot by 7-foot hut had neither water or electricity, but it was next to the bungalow in which her widowed mother lived. She lived a simple life, making her own clothes, growing vegetables in her small garden, and apparently she kept chickens. She had a few friends and was happy with that. One fateful morning she decided to visit her brother and his wife in Woking to show them her new puppy. It was 6 a.m. and the walk was a 30-mile hike. To save money, Dagmar chose to walk and occasionally hitched a lift from a truck driver who, it was said, she felt more secure with than car drivers. Dagmar didn't make it to her brother's. Dagmar's body would be discovered in a ditch by a passing car who had stopped to see what was lying in the road. It was a shoe. He then found the other shoe and Dagmar. The police surgeon examined her body that was entangled in some shrubbery. He noted the blue bruising around her neck, indicating she had been strangled, with possibly a scarf. A search of the area didn't produce any scarves. There was no handbag or identification at all, but they did find a hairnet tangled up on a branch with some hair strands still in it. It was the Chief Constable of Kent County Police who had asked for Scotland Yard's help.
Fabian was called out a few hours later. Studying the photographs, Fabian and Rawlings deduced that there hadn't been a struggle, and the woman's body had been dumped there. The Home Office pathologist, Dr. Keith Simpson, agreed, stating that she'd been sat upright for some time after she had died. He said that the blood drains inward from the skin cells of a corpse. Working as a team, they guessed that she could possibly have been sitting in a car. The doctor thought it was probably a seat that was less upholstered than a car seat. Fabian ordered Rawlings to check all lorries that were on the A20 road on Rotherham Hill between hours of 5 and 8 a.m. Officers from all areas would spend the rest of the day checking with all haulage companies, delivery firms, lorry drivers and garages, checking all the travel logs. It would be the next day that Dagmar was identified. Fabian spoke with Dagmar's distraught mother. She gave him as much detail as she could about her daughter's last morning. She had left around 5 a.m. She had carried a small case containing sandwiches and a gift for her sister-in-law. She had a purse and a yellow string bag. They hadn't found any of those things at Rotherham Hill, so Chief Detective Superintendent Frank Smead of Kent County Police sent out 100 officers to search a larger area. Photos of similar items to those they were looking for were also distributed, but the string handbag had been uniquely made by Dagmar's sister-in-law, so they struggled to find something that looked similar. The sister-in-law listened to Fabian as he asked her if she could make another one so that it may help catch the killer. She didn't hesitate and sat all night making the exact same bag. As soon as they had the bag from the good sister-in-law, a photo of it was put in the newspaper. A few days later, a young boy saw it and exclaimed he'd found a bag just like it in a lake not far from the crime scene. His father took him straight to the police station. When the detectives heard this, they were excited, as this could hold some clues. Unfortunately, the young boy had passed the bag on to his neighbour, who in turn had passed it on to a friend. They didn't hold much hope in finding anything on the bag, as they'd been told by all the women that it had been scrubbed. Luckily, forensics, Dr. H.S. Holden, did find 3 distinct types of hairs caught in the fibres. 2 were human and 1 a brown and black dog. The hairs belonged to the sister-in-law and the other Dagmar, confirming it was her bag. They searched for miles along the hedgerow towards London and started to come across fragments of the brown attaché case she had carried with her. It became clear this was the murder trail. While the officers searched through the hedgerows, Fabian and Rawlings looked through all 1,500 statements. After some time, they grew tired and decided to leave it for the night. But they couldn't sleep, and Fabian couldn't shake off the thought about the bag being taken over a field just to throw it into a lake, when the other items had just been discarded in a hedgerow. Fabian looked at Rawlings and said, "What if it was thrown into a stream and it ended up in the lake?" With this, the next day they discovered the lake water came from the old mill stream at East Malling. The 2 detectives tested the theory for themselves by throwing a bottle into the stream and seeing where it ended up. 3 hours later it arrived bobbing up and down in the lake, but they were still struggling to find a connection. All the lorry drivers they had spoken to hadn't delivered to the mill. As Fabian wandered around the works, he came across a pile of bricks and asked where they had come from. The answer was they belonged to a building subcontractor who kept his own books. After talking to the subcontractor, they learned the bricks had been delivered by a haulage firm in Cambridge. Now, in Cambridge, the haulage firm confirmed they had delivered bricks in a 4-ton Albion lorry to East Malling
on October the 31st. An angry Fabian wanted to know why this firm hadn't been checked. He was promptly informed that the firm was just out of their district, so they hadn't questioned them. And now calm Fabian asked who was the driver that day of that lorry. Sidney Sinclair, who had oddly left about a week before the police turned up. Mr. Sinclair was invited to be questioned at the station by Fabian. When he arrived, Fabian took one look at him. This heavy-built man with a beat-up look about him gave Fabian the feeling he was an ex-con. An old ex-con. "Now come on, what's your real name?" Fabian asked. The man looked at the floor and gave them his name. "Harry Hagger," he replied. After checking the criminal records, they discover Hagger had 16 convictions, including assault on a woman. They informed Hagger they were investigating the death of a woman found at Rotherham Hill on October the 31st, and they knew he was on that road that day. They also told him they had found the attacher case torn and thrown, along with a brown paper bag that had belonged to the deceased woman on Winterfield Lane on that same route. A defeated-looking Hagger sat down and admitted to finding the case, but had thrown it away. After taking a statement from him, they took him to the Winterfield Lane, where he pointed to a spot he'd thrown the case contents, and, he said, the vest. A puzzled Fabian knew nothing of a vest, as he believed the woman was fully clothed. What he didn't know was that Dagmar wore a man's vest she had bought cheap as a scarf, tucking it inside her coat collar to keep the cold out on her long walk. They found the woolen vest and sent it straight to the lab. Dagmar's hairs were found to be on it, and the material markings matched the ridge marks on Dagmar's neck. Making his statement, Hagger claimed he hadn't meant to kill her. He went on to claim that Dagmar had tried to steal his wallet out of his jacket that was hanging in his lorry, and he had struggled with her. He went to court and gave his case. The trial focused on his assertion of experiencing blackouts due to a head injury from years earlier when he leapt out of a moving train while being arrested. The defence portrayed him as teetering on the brink of insanity, claiming he was unaware of his actions when he took Dagmar's life. However, the trial concluded in just 2 days. Hagger was found guilty and hanged at Wandsworth Prison. Robert Honey Fabian's last case. The unsolved brutal murder of Jerzy Strazadler, known fondly as George by the Welsh community. But this murder would challenge even Chief Inspector Robert Honey Fabian of Scotland Yard. The name George was adopted by Jerzy after coming to South Wales from Poland after World War II. Mostly because his new neighbours in Aberdare couldn't manage to pronounce his real name, like myself. He was well liked in the community and regarded as a quiet man with a smile for everyone. And he would send money and clothing parcels back home to his elderly mother in Poland. Having found work at a colliery in Herwan, the 33-year-old, who was lodging at a nearby miners' hostel, had gone for a walk on the evening of Monday 19th of April 1948, making the fateful decision to cut through the town's park. In Aberdare Park he was viciously attacked and stabbed 44 times in the upper body, had his money and watch stolen, and was left for dead in a flower bed. Why hadn't anybody heard his screams? Because it was first thought that someone may have heard him scream.
but the reason nobody in the houses across the street had heard him scream is likely because the first blow of the killer's knife was to his throat. It was a senseless act which shocked the community, leaving them afraid to go out at night. The discovery of Jersey's body in the shrubbery was made the next day by 3 schoolboys who stumbled across it. Glanville Davis came across a lame bird on the ground and shared how they decided it would be a pity to let the bird die. Their attention was then drawn to a man lying among the plants, prompting them to quickly rush to the nearest house for assistance. The local police were alerted and set up barricades around the scene, while word of the incident eventually reached the ears of Scotland Yard. Fabian was dispatched to the valleys to help solve the case, setting up an HQ in the town's Market Street. Fabian had become quite a celebrity after the Antiquist case and had been all over the news. Reports even documented what he wore each day, detailing his grey soft hat and grey suit, topped off with a white handkerchief in his breast pocket. Hundreds of door-to-door inquiries by plainclothes and uniformed police officers were being carried out in Aberdare in an attempt to piece together the identity of the killer, with Fabian praising the borough's bobbies as an excellent lot of chaps who are only too glad to do all they can. However, despite that and the high level of media attention, progress was painfully slow. A description of a short, thick-set man aged in his late 20s, who'd initially been spotted in the park on the night in question, didn't lead to any positive IDs. Indeed, no one could understand how someone would most definitely have been covered in Jersey's blood could have left the area without being spotted. The question was someone helping him hide? One thing was for sure, he was still out there somewhere. Fabian summoned to Aberdare a Home Office expert with a mine detector to search through the park's flower beds. But they only found a clasp knife that was so old and rusted that everyone discounted it from having anything to do with the stabbing. Onlookers gathered to observe as the lake was being searched. An officer in waders waded into the water, retrieved an object from the reeds, and only to discover it was a piece of wood. Banknotes were handed over to the police as they looked as if they were stained with blood, but it couldn't be proven that the blood belonged to the dead man or had been transferred onto the notes by possibly the local butcher. There were some odd twists about this case. The blood on the banknotes was sent away for testing, but oddly there is no record of whether the blood was later found to be human or that of an animal. And in a strange turn of events, a waistcoat and a pair of trousers were discovered abandoned near the colliery in Herwan. There was speculation that they might have been left there by the perpetrator. However, they appeared to be in too good a condition to have been connected to the violent crime. A frustrated Fabian confessed to a reporter at the Aberdare Leader. A resident came forward with a story this week which, had he done so in the first few days, would have cut our inquiries down by a third. Fabian was no longer calm and definitely not happy. But why? We don't know. And for years various theories have emerged about the murder. Some suggesting that Jersey may have had a conflict with a former POW who recognised him from the war. Maybe Jersey or the killer could have been a guard at the former POW camp. In a post made years later, someone mentioned a theory that the murder could be linked to espionage or an unresolved grudge from Poland. Jerzy George Strazadala was laid to rest with a funeral service at St. Teresa's Church, prior to which many people lined the streets in order to pay their last respects.
Fabian would retire from the force the following year, 1949. After retiring from the police force, he turned to writing and broadcasting, sharing his experiences and insights into the criminal mind with a fascinated public. He was offered a TV series on some of his cases, and he travelled across the pond to appear on US TV and made several radio appearances. Robert Honey Fabian died on June the 14th, 1978, in Epsom, Surrey, at the age of 77. He is remembered for his outstanding detective work during his time. Thank you for watching.